You don't see anything at first, that's the worst part. In Prescott National Forest, the dark isn't empty, it's crowded with distance, with trees that swallow shapes, with gullies that twist your sense of direction. And then you hear it. Not a random snap of a twig, not wind, not an animal moving off. A sound with intention. A rhythm. A pause that feels like it's waiting for your next move. In the seconds after, your brain starts building explanations, but your body already knows one thing. You're not alone out here. Welcome to Verified Souls. Tonight, we're following 9 moments where the only warning wasn't a shadow or a set of eyes. It was a sound that shouldn't have been there, in places where you can't afford to be wrong. Stay with me to the last story, because the final one doesn't come from far away in the trees. It happens close enough that you'll feel it against the tent wall. If you want more nights like this, where the forest doesn't need to show itself to make you listen, hit subscribe and lock in with Verified Souls. Don't just watch, keep your signal on. We'd picked a high ridge because it felt safe. That was the logic. Anyway, get above the drainages, away from the creek beds, away from the cold pockets where fog collects and makes every shadow look like a person. Up there, the ponderosas were tall and spaced out, the ground a thick mat of needles that muffled your steps. You could see gaps between trunks, see the slope fall away, and when the wind moved through, it sounded clean and honest. Late fall in Prescott National Forest has this brittle edge to it, like the air wants to snap. By the time the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast enough that our breath looked like smoke. We weren't deep in some dramatic wilderness. We weren't lost. We weren't doing anything reckless. Just a simple overnighter practice for winter. Test the new sleeping pads. See how our layers handled the cold. We pitched the tent in a shallow dip off the ridgeline, tucked behind a few boulders to cut the wind. There was a small fire ring someone had built long before, black stones and a little ash, and we used it because it was already there. When the flames died down, the forest felt larger. The stars were bright in that high, dry air, and for a while, the quiet was a relief. The first time I heard the knocking, I didn't even sit up. 3 slow taps, evenly spaced, not random, not frantic, not like a branch hitting another branch. It sounded like wood struck by something hard, something with weight behind it. Tap, tap, tap. I lay there, still, listening to my own breathing in the sleeping bag, waiting for the familiar follow-up noise, the scrape of a boot, a cough, an animal snort, anything that told my brain what it was supposed to be afraid of. Nothing came. The air outside the tent was so cold it felt sharp, but the sound carried as if it were right there, up the slope, just beyond the boulders. I glanced over. The person next to me was awake too. I could tell because the fabric near his shoulder shifted slightly, and then went still again, like he'd realized movement made noise. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He didn't answer immediately, which somehow made it worse. Then, quietly, like he didn't want to give the forest our voices, he said, "Yeah." We waited. The kind of waiting that makes your ears strain so hard you start hearing your own pulse. In the distance, there was a faint rush of wind in the canopy, and somewhere far below the ridge, a single coyote yipped once and stopped. Then the knocking came again, 3 taps, the same pace, the same force, like whoever or whatever was doing it had a metronome. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it sounded closer, not by a lot, just enough that my skin tightened and my mouth went dry. My first thought was another camper messing around, maybe someone with a hatchet and a dead log, thinking it was funny. But we'd seen no headlights on the road no other lanterns, no voices. And who wanders a ridge at 1 in the morning, in below freezing cold, just to knock on wood in perfect rhythm? The second thought was an animal. A woodpecker, maybe. Except no woodpecker sounds like that at night, and no woodpecker hits 3 times and waits, like it's listening for an answer. I unzipped the sleeping bag slowly and reached for the headlamp, careful not to let the plastic buckle click too loud. When I turned it on, the beam looked weak, like the cold was stealing its strength. The light caught the tent wall from the inside, turning it a dim gray. I could hear the other person's breathing, shallow and controlled, like he was trying not to let panic use up oxygen. I said, louder now, "Hello?" No response, not even a rustle. Just the sense of our voices being absorbed by the needles and trunks, and then, after a long pause, the knocking again. Tap, tap, tap. And now it wasn't up the slope. It was off to the side. Same distance, different direction, like something had moved without needing to walk. I pressed my palm against the ground through the sleeping pad, trying to feel vibration, trying to convince myself it was acoustics, the way sound can bounce off rocks and trick you. But it didn't feel like a bounce. It felt placed. We both sat up. The tent fabric tightened as we moved, and for a second, I hated the noise we made, hated announcing our shape, our location. I unzipped the tent, just enough to push the headlamp beam outside. The night hit my face like a slap. The light cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the nearest boulder and the needles beyond. No eyeshine, no movement, nothing but trees standing still in the cold. And then the knocking came again, closer than before, and it didn't echo the way it should have. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like it was coming from behind the tent. I snapped the beam around, sweeping it across trunks, across the uneven ground. Still nothing. The world outside the light felt thick, as if the darkness had weight. I listened for footsteps, gravel crunch, needles compressing, the soft scuff of something shifting position. There was none. Just that steady, deliberate sound, repeating in a pattern that made my brain itch. My companion whispered, "Do it back." I didn't want to. Something about answering felt like agreement. But I understood the instinct, turn it into a game, force it to become human and stupid. I grabbed a dead branch near the entrance and crawled halfway out, keeping my knees low, staying close to the tent like it was cover. The cold bit through my gloves immediately. I found a fallen log beside the boulders, lifted the branch, and struck 3 times, trying to match the spacing. Tap, tap, tap. My version sounded dull, weak, like hitting wet cardboard. The other sound, whoever owned it, had a crisp, hollow resonance, as if it knew exactly what to hit to make the forest carry it. The response came almost immediately. Tap, tap, tap. Not from the ridge, not from behind the tent, from somewhere just beyond my headlamp's reach, to my right, close enough that the hair on my arms rose under my sleeves. I froze in a half-crouch, branch still raised. For a second, I couldn't make myself turn my head. I held the beam forward, stubbornly pointed at empty ground, as if refusing to look could keep the world simple. Then another set of knocks came, and this time it wasn't 3. Tap, 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 tap. 5. Faster. Like impatience, like escalation. I backed toward the tent without taking my eyes off the trees ahead. The needles were silent under my boots, which should have been comforting, but instead it made me feel like I was floating, like the forest could move quietly too. I got inside, zipped the tent with shaking hands, and killed the headlamp to save battery. In the dark, the sound felt even closer, because there was nothing to contradict it with sight. Tap, 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 tap. It moved again, not in a circle, not in a straight line. It just shifted, appearing in another place, as if distance meant nothing. I started to notice something else. Every time we whispered, every time we made a small noise, the knocking paused. Then it resumed, slightly closer, like it was tracking us by sound. We decided to leave. Not in the dramatic way people imagine, no shouting, no sprinting through trees. It was a quiet decision made in 2 glances, a shared understanding that staying meant we'd spend the rest of the night watching the tent wall and listening for the next set of taps. We began packing in the dark, hands clumsy. The cold made plastic stiff and zippers stubborn. Every movement sounded too loud. And then the forest gave us something new. A long creak, deep and slow, like a tree under stress, a groan that seemed to rise from the ground itself. My mind immediately pictured a dead trunk tipping over, the kind of silent killer that drops without warning. I felt my stomach turn, but no crash followed, no impact, no branches snapping. Just that groan fading into nothing, as if it had been a throat clearing in the dark. The knocking returned. 3 taps again, slow and careful. Tap, tap, tap. Except now, it was ahead of us, in the direction we'd planned to walk back. It wasn't just close, it felt placed on the path, like a hand on a door handle. We stood there, packs half slung, and I realized we'd made a mistake hours earlier when choosing where to camp. We'd set up in a shallow depression behind boulders, thinking it would block wind. But it also blocked sound, and worse, it created the perfect bowl for echoes and misdirection. If something wanted to stay unseen, it had chosen a smart stage. My companion tried to laugh and failed. It's probably just, he didn't finish. There wasn't a convincing just left. The temperature kept dropping. My phone battery was already low from the cold. The headlamp's beam looked weaker every time I clicked it on. We had a choice. Move toward the knocking on the trail we knew. Or step off into the timber and gamble on direction by compass. In the dark. On a slope that could twist an ankle or funnel us into a drainage. The knocking decided for us. It hit 3 times hard, so close it felt like it vibrated in my teeth. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't think. I just moved. We stepped off the trail and started side-hilling through trees, forcing ourselves to go slow enough not to fall, fast enough not to listen too hard. I held the compass low and kept the needle steady, picking a bearing that should intersect a creek that ran down to a forest road. The idea wasn't elegant, it was survival math. Behind us, the knocks continued for a short while, always from the ridge, always spaced like a countdown. Then, without any fade, without any sense of distance increasing, they stopped. The silence after them was worse than the sound itself, because it left room for imagination. It left room for footsteps. We never heard footsteps. We never heard anything follow us. And yet, every few minutes, I had the sensation, physical, undeniable, that if I turned my headlamp behind me, the beam would catch something standing just beyond the edge of light, perfectly still, waiting for my attention like a trap. An hour later, we heard water. Not loud at first, just a faint, steady rush that meant downhill and out. We found the creek by feel more than sight, and followed it carefully, slipping on slick stones until we hit the faint track of a road. When we finally saw the dull shape of our vehicle, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like waking up after a nightmare and realizing your heart is still racing. We drove out without talking much. The heater blasted, making our hands sting as circulation returned. Somewhere behind us, the ridge disappeared into darkness again, keeping whatever rules it played by. In daylight, weeks later, curiosity brought me back, not to camp, not to challenge anything, just to settle the itch in my brain. The place looked harmless, ordinary. Sun on bark, wind in needles, a few old fire scars on trunks. But near the old fire ring, where our tent had been, I saw something that made my stomach tighten all over again. 3 shallow dents in the dirt, evenly spaced, as if something had pressed down hard at the exact rhythm of those knocks. I stood there too long, listening. And in the quiet between gusts, for just a moment, I thought I could hear it again. 3 slow taps on wood, coming from somewhere up on the ridge, perfectly patient, like it had never left. I went into that drainage thinking it would be the calm part of the day. You know the kind of place I mean, where the trail fades into damp sand and rounded stone, where the air smells like wet granite and crushed leaves, and the sound of water smooths out whatever is rattling around in your head. Early spring in Prescott National Forest can feel like a trick. Warm sun on your shoulders. Then a cold thread of shade down in the cuts where snowmelt runs. I'd come alone for wildflower photos, and the simple satisfaction of following water downhill until it connected with something familiar again. At first, everything made sense. The creek was up, lively from thaw, pushing around little sticks and foam. The banks were lined with dark rock and pale sand, and in the softer spots, I could see animal tracks, small deer prints, the pinprick dots of birds, the occasional drag mark where something had slid back into the water. My boots crunched lightly when I stepped on gravel, but mostly the ground was soft with silt and needles. The walls of the drainage weren't high enough to be a canyon, not exactly, but steep enough that you felt tucked in. Sound stayed close. That's what I liked about it. Then I heard the crying. Not loud, not theatrical, not the kind of scream you'd expect from a horror movie. It was quiet and tired, like someone trying not to be heard. A child's voice, maybe 6 or 7 small, breathy sobs that rose and fell under the rush of the creek. If you've ever heard a kid cry when they think they're in trouble but still hoping an adult will show up, you know the sound. It hits a part of your brain you can't ignore. I stopped mid-step, one boot on a flat rock, the other in shallow water, and I listened. The crying came from around the next bend upstream, where the creek curved behind a pile of boulders. I didn't see anyone. I didn't see a bright jacket or a backpack or a parent, just wet stone and moving water. My first thought was that the sound was traveling weird, maybe another hiker's kid somewhere above me, the drainage acting like a speaker tube. But the sobs were too clear, too close, like they were meant for my ears and no one else's. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice calm. "Hey, are you okay?" The crying stopped so abruptly it felt like someone covered a mouth. For a few seconds, there was only the creek. Then even the creek sounded wrong. Not quieter exactly, but flattened, like the air had thickened. I waited for a reply, for footsteps on rock, for a parent's voice answering back, embarrassed and apologetic. Nothing. I should have turned around then. That's the truth. But a different truth is that leaving felt like abandoning someone who might be hurt. And that's how you get pulled deeper into places you don't understand by the part of you that wants to be decent. I started walking again, stepping carefully from rock to rock. The water was cold enough to sting through the soles when I slipped. The bend came up, and as I rounded it, I expected to see a small figure sitting on a rock, knees hugged to chest, or maybe a teenager twisted up in a fall, crying because they were scared. There was nobody there. Just the creek bending again, the drainage narrowing slightly, and a strip of sand pressed smooth by recent water. And then the crying resumed. But it wasn't behind me. It was ahead, still ahead, just around the next bend. Same tone, same exhausted sob. It matched my pace, like it had been waiting for me to get close enough. That's when I got my first real chill. The kind that starts between your shoulder blades. Not fear, exactly, more like your instincts stepping forward and clearing their throat. I told myself it was echoes. I told myself sound travels. I told myself there was a kid farther up, and the bends were just hiding them. So I went on. Each curve I turned gave me the same thing. Empty creek. Empty rock. Empty sand. And still, the crying ahead. Always the same distance. Never getting closer. Never drifting farther away. It was like chasing a voice in fog. I tried to reason it out with my phone. I pulled up my map app, watched the blue dot pulse, and for a second, it did what it was supposed to do, showed me exactly where I was, along a squiggle of drainage. Then it jumped, just snapped a few 100 feet uphill like a glitch, then back into the creek, then sideways onto the slope. The signal bars dipped, the dot spun. I stood still and watched it lie to me. You know that feeling when your tools stop being tools, when the thing you depend on turns into noise? It makes you suddenly aware of how quiet your own knowledge is. The crying shifted, and I realized with a slow, sinking certainty that it was getting clearer when I stood still. When I moved, it softened under the water. When I stopped, the sobs sharpened. Like the forest was adjusting the volume for attention. "Where are you?" I called again. This time my voice sounded too loud in my own ears, and the drainage didn't echo it the way it should have. It came back dead. The crying hiccuped once, almost like a laugh caught in a throat, and then it added something new. A faint hum threaded through the sobbing. 3 notes, not quite a tune. Like someone trying to remember a lullaby, but only finding the shape of it. I felt my mouth go dry. The air down there had cooled. The sun that had been on my shoulders was gone, stolen by the narrowing walls and the angle of the day. Shadows pooled in places where the creek cut deep. My damp boot started to numb. I flexed my toes and felt the cold spread. I told myself I'd go one more bend. Just one. Then I'd turn around. That's what I promised myself. Like a bargain. The next bend opened into a section where the creek dropped. Not a waterfall exactly, but a steep pour-off into a narrow slot. The water disappeared into a dark crease between rocks and came out below as a louder rush. The walls were slick with moss. It wasn't something you climbed down without rope or a very bad plan. And the crying now, it came from below. Directly below the pour-off, down in the slot. It didn't make sense. It couldn't. You don't get down there without committing. You don't get a child down there. And if someone was hurt down there, they'd be screaming, not softly crying like a secret. I approached the edge anyway, slow, careful, because I couldn't help myself. I lay flat on my stomach and leaned forward, trying to see into the slot without putting weight on the slick rock. The air coming up from the crack was colder, a damp breath of stone. "Hey," I said, quieter now. "Can you hear me?" The crying stopped again. This time it didn't just stop. It cut off mid-breath, like a recording paused. And in the sudden gap, I became aware of something else. My own breathing. Too fast, too loud, filling my ears. Then, from down in the slot, I heard a single inhale, not a sob, not a sniffle. An inhale that sounded adult, controlled, like someone testing the air. My stomach tightened so hard I felt it in my throat. I backed away from the edge, pushing with my palms, careful not to slip. My hands were wet now, and the rock felt slick and eager. I sat up and looked around, like a person waking from a dream. Trees, rock, water, all normal. Nothing moving, nothing visible. No one up on the banks, no bright color, no shape. I stood, and that was when I saw the footprints. Small prints in wet sand, on a patch near the creek, toes and heel marks, like a kid had stepped there recently. They pointed upstream toward the pour-off, but they ended at bare rock. Just stopped, as if the person had lifted straight into the air. There weren't adult prints beside them, no drag marks, no stumble. My skin crawled. I told myself, animal. Raccoon. Something that could look small. But I knew what a raccoon track looks like. These were too human. I turned to leave, and the crying moved. Not faded, not echoed, not carried by the water. It moved instantly to behind me, downstream like it had been waiting there the whole time, just out of my sight. I spun so fast my wet boot slipped, and I windmilled my arms to keep from going down. The creek rushed. The rocks stayed still. The forest watched. And the crying, quiet, patient came again from downstream. The direction I needed to go. To get out. This is the part I need you to understand. It wasn't just scary. It was insulting. Like something had learned exactly what would make me hesitate. I took a step downstream. The crying softened, like it was satisfied. I took another step, and it sharpened again. I stopped, it stopped. I moved, it moved. It kept me on a string, measuring my choices. That's when I realized the light was changing. The drainage was swallowing daylight faster than it should have, and the shadows were turning the rocks into shapes my brain couldn't stop interpreting. If I stayed much longer, I'd be navigating whetstone in full dusk, with one boot soaked and my hands cold. I forced myself to do something simple. Pick an exit strategy that didn't involve chasing sound. I turned my attention away from the crying and listened for something real, road noise, wind in treetops, anything consistent. But all I had was water and that voice, so I went old school. I pulled out my paper map, the one I'd almost left in the car, because it felt unnecessary. I found the drainage line, traced it with my finger, and identified where it should widen, toward a crossing that linked back to a larger route. Then I started moving fast. Not running. Running on wet rock is how you end up injured and truly trapped. But moving with purpose. I stepped where the gravel was stable, used my poles for balance, and kept my eyes down. My heart hammered, and I could taste adrenaline, metallic on my tongue. The crying kept pace behind me for a while, faint under the creek's rush, like it didn't need to shout anymore. It knew I could hear it. And then, without warning, it stopped. No fade, no last sob, just gone. The quiet after it was so sudden that I almost slowed down out of disbelief. And that's when the real danger hit. Without the sound, I realized how alone I was in that drainage, how quickly evening was coming, how cold my wet foot had become. Fear had been distracting me. Silence brought me back to my body. I kept going until the drainage widened and the walls softened, until I could see more sky. The air warmed slightly. I heard a distant, steady sound that didn't belong to the creek, the faint hush of a road somewhere, tires on dirt. It was the sweetest thing I'd heard all day. When I finally stepped up onto higher ground and saw the open trees beyond the cut, it felt like stepping out of a room where someone had been standing behind you the whole time. Back at home, curiosity got the better of me. I dumped my camera files onto my computer, hoping for something that would make me feel less crazy. Maybe I'd captured another hiker in a frame without realizing it. Maybe the crying was a bird, a weird echo, anything. The photos were normal: granite, water, wildflowers, shadows. Then I checked a short video clip I'd taken of the creek early on, before the pour-off. The audio was mostly water, like you'd expect, but under it, faint, thin, almost lost, there was a soft hitching sound, a layered sniffle that didn't match the rhythm of the water at all. It started right after the first time I called out. And right at the end of the clip, so quiet I almost missed it, there was a tiny hum, 3 notes threaded into the noise like it had always been there, waiting for someone to pay attention. I shut my laptop and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the ordinary sounds of my house. The refrigerator cycling, the distant traffic, the safe, boring world. Because even now, if I close my eyes, I can still hear it in that drainage crying that never got closer, never got farther, always just around the next bend, like the forest learned the exact sound that would make me follow. We didn't mean to be out there that late. It started as one of those afternoons that feels endless. Warm light, dry air, the kind of weather that convinces you dusk is still hours away. We were scouting an overgrown fire road we'd spotted on a map. Nothing official, just a thin line cutting across a slope through ponderosa and scrub oak. The idea was simple: see if it stayed rideable, see where it reconnected, maybe mark a few spots to come back with bikes. We had water, snacks, one headlamp between us, because we weren't planning to need it, and the lazy confidence that comes with being not that far from the car. There were 3 of us. I was the one who paid too much attention to the map. One of us carried the headlamp. The third, always the loudest, always the one who whistled when things got quiet, kept making jokes about horror movies the deeper we went, like saying it out loud would keep it from happening. The fire road itself was barely a road. It was a strip of packed dirt interrupted by erosion ruts, with grass and young pines pushing in from both sides. Old tire tracks were faint, like they'd been pressed in years ago and slowly erased by seasons. By the time the sun dipped behind the slope, the temperature dropped in that quick, dry way it does in northern Arizona. The air stopped feeling friendly. Shadows got longer and sharper, pooling in the ruts and under the scrub oak like water. We were still relaxed, but the forest was starting to change tone, the birds settling down, the wind flattening, the kind of quiet that makes you realize you've been talking too loud. That's when the first voice happened. We'd paused, because the loud one stepped off the road into the brush to relieve himself. The 2 of us left on the road stood there, idly kicking at gravel, waiting, listening to the soft crackle of pine needles under our boots. It was calm, ordinary, and then, from farther up the fire road, way ahead, beyond a shallow bend, we heard his voice call out, clear as day. Not a shout, not muffled, not echoing. Just his voice saying, my name, then the other's name. Then, like he was impatient, hey, come on. It made my brain short-circuit for a second. Because I'd just watched him step into the brush behind us. There was no way he'd sprinted past without us seeing, and even if he had, why would he call from up ahead like we were lagging? I turned toward the bend and called back, very funny. The other person beside me laughed, but it came out forced. I could hear the question under it. He lifted his chin as if trying to spot movement up the road. And that's when the loud one came back out of the brush behind us, still adjusting his belt, looking at us like we were the weird ones. What? He asked. Why are you yelling? I didn't answer right away. My throat felt tight, and I hate admitting that because nothing had even happened yet, nothing physical, nothing you can point to. But something about hearing a voice in the wrong place makes your body react before your mind can catch up. We just heard you, I said. Up the road. He frowned. No, you didn't. We all stood there, a small triangle of confusion in the dimming light. The forest seemed to lean in around us, like it had been waiting for us to notice. Then the voice called again. This time it wasn't casual. It was strained, urgent, his voice. Exactly his voice, coming from the same spot ahead. Help me, seriously help. It landed in the air like a stone. The loud one went pale in the fading light. You could see the joking part of him shut off, like a switch. He looked from us, to the bend, then back, as if trying to find the trick, the person with a speaker, the hidden friend. But there was no one else. No footsteps, no crunch of gravel, no rustle of brush moving fast. Just that voice, hanging there. I could feel my skin prickling on my arms. My thoughts started stacking. Another group? Someone mimicking? A weird echo? But the road wasn't a canyon. It wasn't a hard rock wall that could throw sound like that. It was open forest. Soft needles. Trees that swallow echoes. What the hell is that? The one with the headlamp whispered. Before we could decide anything, the voice called again, now sharper, pleading, like someone struggling to breathe. Come up here. Hurry. And that's how we started walking toward it. Because the human brain hates unfinished patterns. It hates unanswered calls. Even when you know it's wrong, there's a part of you that wants to solve it by getting closer. We moved slowly, watching the shadows. The light was dim enough now that the trees ahead looked like stacked silhouettes. The fire road climbed gently, curving just enough that you couldn't see beyond the bend where the voice kept coming from. I remember the air smelling like dry pine sap and dust, and I remember how loud our boots sounded on gravel once we stopped joking and started listening. The loud one stayed close to me, unusually quiet. He kept swallowing hard, like his mouth had gone dry. We reached the bend. There was nothing there. No person, no injury, no scuffle marks, just the road continuing on, narrowing between thicker trees. The slope dropped away on one side, into scrub and loose rock. On the other side, the bank rose, rutted with old runoff lines. We stopped, and for a moment, the forest was normal again. Wind and needles, distant bird calls fading into evening. The silence was almost a relief. Then the voice spoke again. Now closer, too close, like it had stepped right up to the edge of our hearing. It said, "You left me." My stomach turned so fast it felt like falling. That sentence wasn't something the loud one would say as a joke. And it wasn't something you'd yell for help. It was intimate, accusatory, like it belonged to a conversation we weren't having. "Stop," the loud one said, and his voice cracked. "Stop doing that." No one answered. But we heard something else then. A soft compression in the needles off the road, to our right. Not a clear step, more like weight shifting. Then another, farther back, like something pacing parallel to us in the trees. We held still, listening. The voice came again, and it was wrong in a way that's hard to explain, unless you've heard a perfect imitation that still doesn't feel alive. Same pitch, same cadence, but flattened like an audio file played through fabric. It said, "Don't you want to help?" The one with the headlamp clicked it on. The beam cut a pale tunnel through the trees, catching floating dust, lighting up bark and low branches. Nothing moved, no eye shine, no silhouette stepping away. But the feeling didn't go away. The feeling that something was just outside the light, not hiding, exactly waiting. We should have turned around then. We talked about it in fragments. Let's go back. This is stupid. It's just, I don't know. But the voice kept tugging at us, calling from ahead and then pausing when we spoke, like it was listening for cues. That's when it started getting specific. From farther up the road, the voice said, "Bring the red pack." The loud one didn't have a red pack. None of us did. Our packs were dark black and gray. It was such a small detail, but it snapped something in me. Because if a person was messing with us, they could see us. They'd know. And if it wasn't a person, why would it guess wrong? I felt the need to prove control. I raised my voice into the trees. "Who is this?" The response came immediately. A perfect copy of my own voice, repeating the last three words back to me. Same accent, same rhythm, only slightly delayed, as if it had to process it first. "Who is this?" My throat went cold, my skin goosebumped so hard it hurt. The loud one grabbed my sleeve. "Nope," he whispered. "No, we're leaving." We turned around as a unit and started back down the fire road. Faster now, not running but moving with intention. The headlamp beam bobbed, catching ruts and rocks. The light made the trees look closer than they were. I could hear my own breathing, and I hated how loud it sounded. Like it was advertising us. Behind us, the voice changed. It stopped pretending to be helpful. It started calling the loud one's name, not just the short version, but his full name, the way a parent says it when they're angry. Then it said a middle name. A middle name I'd never heard him tell anyone out there. He froze for half a second, like his feet forgot how to work. Then he lurched forward again, almost tripping into an erosion rut. I caught his shoulder and yanked him upright. "That's not real," I said, but I didn't believe myself. Not fully. I was saying it like a charm. The footsteps in the trees returned soft compressions that weren't matching our pace exactly, more like a circle tightening. I kept swinging the headlamp beam to the right, then left, trying to catch movement. Each time the beam hit the trees, the woods looked empty and harmless. Each time I moved it away, I could feel, not see that something shifted. Then a rock clattered down from the bank above the road, bouncing twice before settling in the dirt. It wasn't huge, but it was fresh, like it had just been dislodged. The timing was too perfect, dropping right after the voice said, "Watch out." My nerves snapped. I yelled into the forest, loud, furious, more out of fear than bravery. "Leave us alone." The reply came instantly, my own voice again, but distorted, flattened, repeating the same words back at me like an insult. "Leave us alone." And then, from 3 different directions at once, we heard the loud one scream. Not one scream. 3 layers of it, slightly out of sync, as if the forest had recorded him at different times and played it back from different angles. It was so sharp and so close that my body ducked before my brain could decide what to do. The loud one himself didn't scream, he just made a strangled sound, like his throat had seized. That was the moment we ran. Not a sprint down a clear path, more like a controlled panic, dodging ruts, leaping over exposed roots, slipping in gravel. The headlamp beam bounced wildly, making the road feel like it was moving under us. My heart slammed against my ribs. The loud one kept whispering, "No, no, no," under his breath like he was trying to wake up from a dream. Behind us, the voice kept talking, but we stopped responding. We stopped feeding it. We focused on the only real thing we could control: forward motion, staying upright, staying together. The sound gradually thinned out. The footsteps in the trees faded. The voice turned into distant muttering, then into something that could have been wind. But I didn't feel relief yet. Not until I saw the familiar junction where the fire road met the main trail, wider, clearer. The kind of path that felt observed by normal hikers in daylight. We hit that junction and didn't stop. We followed the main trail back toward the car, with the headlamp steady now. The beam aimed at the ground, like we couldn't trust the trees with our eyes. Every time the wind moved the branches, my shoulders tightened. Every time gravel shifted underfoot, I expected the voice to say my name again. At the trailhead, the parking area was nearly empty. The last light in the sky was dying, and the forest beyond the lot looked like a black wall. We reached the car, slammed the doors, and just sat there breathing, letting the warmth from the heater crawl back into our hands. None of us spoke for a full minute. Then the loud one said, very quietly, "I didn't know you knew my middle name." "I don't," I replied. The one with the headlamp stared straight ahead. "Then how did it?" No one answered. Because the truth was, even if we could come up with a theory, another group, an echo, a cruel prank, none of it explained how the voice moved without moving, how it waited for our words, how it matched us like it had a perfect model of our throats. On the drive home, we tried to talk about normal things. Food, plans, dumb jokes like rejoining regular life could scrub the sound from our heads. But every pause in the conversation felt dangerous, like if we left too much silence in the car, something would fill it. Weeks later, I pulled up satellite maps out of stubbornness. I wanted to see the fire road, trace it, make it make sense. And that's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten all over again. The line we'd followed didn't clearly reconnect the way we thought it did. It thinned into trees, swallowed by unmarked terrain, like it simply stopped being a road and became forest. "And I keep thinking about that first call my name," said in a familiar voice, from a place it couldn't be. Because the scariest part wasn't the scream, or the footsteps, or the repetition. It was how easy it was to make us walk toward it, just by sounding like someone we trusted. It was supposed to be a simple daytime lesson, one of those practical, wholesome things you do because you tell yourself it builds confidence. Late morning, early winter. The kind of cold that doesn't hurt yet, but stays in your fingertips. The sky was overcast, a flat gray lid that made the forest feel closer and quieter than it should. I'd brought a compass, a paper topo map, and just enough snacks and water for what I thought would be a short, controlled loop through open ponderosa. We parked off a dirt road and walked into a stand of tall pines that looked almost park-like, wide spacing, needle-covered ground, scattered granite boulders, like someone had placed them there for decoration. No dramatic cliffs, no tight canyon, no rushing creek. This wasn't the kind of terrain that makes you feel trapped. If anything, it felt forgiving. That's what I liked about it. That's what made what happened feel so wrong. I was with someone younger, old enough to be capable, young enough to still trust me when I said, "We'll be fine." The plan was to practice a straight-line navigation exercise. Pick a bearing, walk it for a set distance, check landmarks, then correct back to the road. I wanted it to be calm. I wanted it to be boring, because boring outdoors skills are the ones that save your life later. We'd been walking maybe 40 minutes when we heard the first scrape. It was distant at first, thin enough that my brain filed it under road noise. You know that sound vehicles make when a trailer hitch drags, or when someone pulls a metal grate across rock. A long metallic grind, uneven, with a sharp edge to it. It didn't fit the forest. It didn't fit the silence. I stopped and held up a hand, listening. The scrape came again. Longer this time. And I felt my jaw tighten. There was no engine with it. No rumble. No human voices. Just metal on stone. Somewhere deeper among the trees. Probably a truck on the road, I said, mostly to keep the mood steady. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't right. The nearest road was behind us, not in front, and the sound wasn't coming from a fixed point. It was drifting sideways, like something heavy being dragged slowly through the forest. We kept walking. I checked the compass, adjusted our line, and tried to ignore it. Then the sound adjusted too, still off to our right, keeping pace. Not matching our steps exactly, but staying in the same relative position, like a companion you can't see. It scraped again. Long, slow, intentional. The younger one looked at me, eyebrows raised, and I saw the question she didn't want to ask. I did what adults do when they don't want fear to spread. I acted normal. I pointed out a boulder. I named a tree. I talked about how overcast light can flatten depth perception. I kept my voice even and practical. The scrape continued at intervals, always to the right. We stopped again to listen more carefully, and that's when something else slid into the silence, an irregular ticking sound, faint but distinct, like metal cooling after being heated. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't constant. It came in short bursts, as if whatever made the scraping was pausing, resting, then shifting. Maybe someone's hauling junk, I said. But who hauls scrap metal through untracked ponderosa, with no vehicle sound, no talking, no dog, no anything? And why would they do it slowly enough that we could keep hearing it from the same distance? We took a few more steps. The forest underfoot was soft with needles, and every now and then, a dead branch snapped with that dry winter crack. The air smelled clean, almost sterile. No bird chatter, no squirrel scolding. The overcast sky made it feel like the day was holding its breath. Then I noticed something on the ground that didn't belong. Two faint lines in the pine duff ahead of us parallel, like something narrow and heavy had been pulled across the forest floor. Not deep enough to be a vehicle, too straight to be animal activity. The needles were disturbed in a clean track, scraped down to lighter soil beneath. I crouched and ran a gloved finger along one line. The needles were freshly displaced, not wet, not old. Recent. A cold thought crept up my spine. The sound wasn't traveling weird. The sound was connected to this. Something had been dragged here. I stood up and looked around. Between the trees, everything looked empty. Trunks, shadowless ground, boulders, nothing else. The younger one asked, "Should we go back?" I almost said yes immediately. Pride stopped me for half a second, the stupid human need to keep a plan intact. So I did the next best thing. I checked our position, took a bearing back toward the road, and decided we'd angle out to reconnect sooner than planned. That way, we weren't running. We were adjusting. As I turned the compass and pointed us left, the scraping sound shifted. Not gradually. It shifted like someone dragging something and deciding to change direction at the same time we did. Still off to our right. Still the same distance. Like it wanted to stay there. Always there. A presence you couldn't see, but couldn't shake. The younger one went quiet. Quiet in a way that told me she was listening harder than she wanted to. We walked faster. Not a jog, but purposeful. I kept my eyes moving, checking the ground for holes, the slope for loose rock, the trees for any hint of movement. The forest looked too clean, too open, like a room with the furniture pushed back. The scraping stopped. For a moment, I felt relief. Then the ticking began again, closer now. Tick, tick, tick. And beneath it, just barely, a faint rattle, like loose chain links being jostled. My stomach tightened. I stopped walking, and the younger one stopped with me, almost bumping my shoulder. We stood still in that gray light and listened. The sound was ahead now, behind a small cluster of boulders, large, rounded granite, big enough to block our view of whatever was on the other side. The scraping resumed, one long, slow grind, and then it halted with a clean metallic shiver, like something heavy had been set down. I didn't want to go toward it. Every survival instinct I have said, keep distance, keep options, don't walk into a blind spot. But the other instinct, the one that hates uncertainty, wanted to see it, wanted to label it, wanted to turn it into something ordinary. I did what I thought was smart in the moment. I spoke. "Hello?" I called. "Everything okay?" No response. The ticking stopped, like it was listening. Then, from behind the boulders, came a faint vibration so subtle I felt it more than heard it. A low tremor through the ground, like the earth itself had a pulse. And then the dragging sound came again, short and sharp, as if something had moved suddenly, just out of sight. That was enough. I told the younger one, "We're leaving. Right now." We turned, and the scraping sound returned from behind us, too close. Not right at our heels, but close enough that the distance felt like a choice it was making. The chain rattle followed, loose and lazy, like it had all the time in the world. We walked faster. My eyes kept flicking to the compass, trying to hold a straight line back to the road. Overcast light can mess with your sense of direction, and without sun as a reference, the forest can rotate around you without you noticing. I didn't want that. I wanted certainty. I wanted a road. The younger one whispered, "It stops when you talk." I hadn't noticed consciously, but she was right. Every time we spoke, the dragging paused. Every time we fell silent, it resumed, as if our voices were a signal flare and our quiet was permission. So we stopped talking. That silence made everything worse. Without words, I could hear details I didn't want. My own breath in my scarf, the soft crunch of our boots, the faint squeak of pack straps, and under it all, that metallic grind, steady, patient, staying just off to our right, like a shadow that didn't match the sun. I glanced back once, just a quick look. Nothing. No movement among the trunks, no glint of metal, no figure bent over dragging anything, just empty forest and boulders and gray light. That emptiness did not comfort me. It made it feel like the sound wasn't attached to something I could see at all. The younger one stumbled on a hidden rut and caught herself, but the slip sent a jolt of panic through both of us. In the same instant, the dragging noise accelerated suddenly faster, harsher, as if whatever was making it had surged forward. It swept in a wide arc through the trees, the sound moving laterally to cut across where we were heading. And then, it stopped dead ahead of us, right in front, behind another set of boulders. I felt my mouth go numb. Not because I thought we were surrounded, not in a physical sense, but because the sound had positioned itself like a barrier. It wasn't chasing from behind anymore. It was anticipating, stepping into our path the way you step into someone's way in a hallway. We stood there, frozen, looking at rocks and trees like they might suddenly explain themselves. The younger one said, so quietly I barely heard, "I don't want to see it." Neither did I. I took out the compass again, hands colder now, and chose a new bearing, one that meant bushwhacking a bit, pushing through thicker scrub to skirt the boulders and avoid the line that led straight into the sound. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't on plan, but it was movement away. We pushed through, shoulders brushing branches, needles catching on jackets. The ground angled slightly downward, loose rock under duff threatened to roll ankles. I kept my pace controlled, because panic makes you careless, and carelessness gets you injured. Behind us, the dragging resumed. But now it was doing something else, matching our changes, staying to the right, never fully fading. The rattle of chain came and went, like someone playing with it. I could feel that low vibration through the ground every few minutes, a subtle pulse that made my teeth feel slightly too big in my mouth. We broke through the thicker scrub and found something that looked like a faint game trail deer path maybe. It wasn't much, but it was a line, and lines mean direction. We followed it, and within 10 minutes, the trees opened and the terrain leveled. And then, finally, we heard something real. The distant, unmistakable hush of a vehicle far off on a dirt road. Normal noise, human noise. A reference point. We followed it until we stepped onto the edge of a forest road, packed dirt, faint tire marks, A strip of open space that made me feel exposed but safe at the same time. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, half expecting to see something metallic glinting between trunks. There was nothing. No scraping, no ticking, no chain rattle. Just wind and gray sky and our breathing. We didn't celebrate. We didn't laugh. We just walked the road back to the car like people coming out of a building after a fire drill, trying not to look shaken. Later, back home, the younger one asked me to look at a photo she'd taken when the sound had surged close, that split-second reaction shot, not aimed at anything, just a nervous snap. I opened it on my screen and zoomed in, expecting nothing. Grain, trees, blur. What I found wasn't a creature or a face. It was smaller than that, and somehow worse for being plausible. In the corner of the frame, barely caught at the edge of the boulder cluster, there was a smooth curved groove on exposed granite like a channel worn into the rock. Not fresh scrape marks, not a single drag line. A polished, repeated arc. As if something heavy and narrow had been pulled across that exact spot again and again until the stone itself gave in. That groove did two things to my mind at once. It offered an explanation, maybe old logging equipment, maybe some forgotten metal object dragged by people long ago. And it raised a question I couldn't shake. If it was old, if it had been made over time, why had it sounded so close today? Why had it moved with us? Why had it acted like it could choose where to be? A week later, driving along the forest edge with the windows cracked, I heard it again, faint, distant, almost swallowed by road noise. That same metallic drag, slow and deliberate, somewhere beyond the trees. And for a second, I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my hands ached. Because part of me was sure that if I pulled over and listened long enough, it would shift to my right, always to my right, like it remembered the route I took to get away. It took me a few seconds to understand what was wrong, because it wasn't a sound that started this time, it was the sudden absence of one. We were halfway down a gentle slope, where mixed pine gives way to scrub oak and juniper. A quiet corner of Prescott National Forest, where the light turns warm and lazy in late summer. Heat shimmered above the ground, that baking, resin-sweet smell hanging in the air, and a thin chorus of insects had been buzzing all afternoon like a soft electrical hum in the trees. I remember lifting my camera to take a shot of a seep below us, and in that instant the forest snapped shut around us like someone had pressed mute on the world. The quiet wasn't normal. It wasn't the way birds pause when a hawk passes, or the lull that settles before dusk. It felt thick, as if the air itself had mass. My ears strained and found nothing. No distant wind combing needles, no leaf rub, no wing flutter. Even our footfalls sounded wrong, dull, and too close, as if we were walking in a carpeted room. I said something small and stupid like, "Huh," because my brain needed an ordinary word to touch. The person with me stopped too, head tilted, eyes narrowing the way people do when they're listening for a frequency they don't trust. We'd come for wildlife photos near the seep, a hopeful shot of a deer in late light, maybe a cluster of birds along damp ground. We'd followed a thin game trail down, checked wind direction, moved slow. Nothing about the plan felt reckless, and yet, right there, everything inside me pulled tight, like a string. "What do you hear?" I asked, even though the better question was what we didn't. They shook their head. "I feel it," they said softly, "like pressure." That was it. It felt like a pressure change. Like when you're in a plane, and your ears can't quite pop. Or when a storm decides to hold its breath before breaking. I clapped once, just to see. The sound died as soon as it left my hands. No echo, no return. If the forest had been a room, the walls had moved inward. We stood there, and standing there made time stretch. When you can't hear the world, you start to hear yourself too loudly. I could hear saliva in my mouth, the hinge of my jaw, the tiny squeak of my pack strap when I shifted my shoulder. The ordinary human noises felt invasive, like they didn't belong to the landscape. I whispered without meaning to, "Let's go back up." Whispering in that mute made me feel like I was talking into a pillow. We turned and started uphill. The trail we'd used wasn't a proper trail, just the suggestion of one. A line of compacted soil where hooves and paws had avoided deadfall. In normal conditions, it would have been easy to follow, but the silence messed with us. Without the small sounds of a living forest to orient us, the wind pushing consistently from one direction, the subtle burble of the seep, the distant tires on a far road. Every gully looked similar. Every clump of oak mirrored the last. The overstory filtered light into a flat wash that erased depth. We took a fork we didn't remember, then another, and within minutes, I realized I didn't recognize the pattern of rocks I'd just stepped past. I checked my GPS, because that's what you do when your senses stop cooperating. The map loaded, the blue dot wavered, and then it froze. Not a big failure, just enough lag to make it unreliable in a moment when reliability was the only thing I wanted. I switched to compass mode, forced my breathing slower, and picked a bearing back toward the road we'd left the car on. It wasn't far. It didn't need to be far. It just needed to be certain. We walked. Our footfalls cushioned into the earth like we were being absorbed. The heat pressed between my shoulder blades and gathered at the base of my neck, and without the relief of wind, I felt sweat bead and not move. The silence made me ration my water faster. Each sip sounded like a waterfall in my head. Then, out of that thick quiet, a single twig snapped. It was so sharp it almost hurt. Not the distant pop of a branch in sun. Not the scamper of a small animal. It was close, precise, and it had the acoustics of an indoor noise. A clean, dry fracture that shouldn't have been possible in open air. We both stopped like animals ourselves. Heads up, shoulders tight. I thought of predators first, because your brain goes there. But predators make other sounds too. Breath, weight, brush. This was just that one perfect snap. We waited. Nothing followed. The silence lay back over us again, heavier, as if what we'd heard had been a test and we'd failed it. I said, treading carefully, "It's probably a deer." The person with me nodded too fast. Yeah. We kept moving. The slope tilted us toward a shallow draw, the kind that collects deadfall in long, bony tangles. I didn't want to go down into it, but the least bad path curved that way. We picked through without speaking, and I hated how each piece of wood I stepped on remained silent under my weight, as if the forest had remote muted the whole scene except for that one twig earlier. When we huffed up the far side, my chest sounded like a drum, and I found myself trying to make my breathing quieter, as if too much noise would attract the attention of whatever had control of the volume knob. Then the radio hissed. It was in the side pocket of my pack. A cheap handheld we keep around, because sometimes in gullies you can't get a text out, but you can bounce a call off a ridge. It was switched off. Fully off. I know, because I'd checked it at the car and decided not to burn battery since we weren't going far. But there it was, emitting a single, short burst of static like a breath forced through teeth. A tight SSSKT. We both froze. I pulled it out and looked at the dial. Off. The switch was firmly on the click. I turned it on then, because doing something felt better than doing nothing. The unit came to life with a thin carrier hiss. I flipped through channels. All I got was that hiss, narrower than usual, as if the radio were hearing the same quiet we were. I turned it off again. For a heartbeat after the click, it gave one last exhale, a whisper that wasn't signal and wasn't electronic, a sound that matched the wordless pressure in the trees around us. "Keep going," I said. And now my voice didn't bother trying to be normal. The ground underfoot changed subtly from soft duff to firmer soil, the kind that sees more animal traffic. My map said the road should be uphill and slightly left. We aimed for that, moving in a straight line as best we could, through low oak, stepping around yucca and rock, trying not to trip. The silence held and stretched, until it felt like time was a held breath too. Then, like a dam breaking, the world came back. It wasn't gradual, it slammed. Wind in the canopy rushed all at once. Insects started up so loudly it sounded like feedback. A bird called with a volume that made me flinch. Even the distant hum of a road returned with an edge I'd never noticed before, like static laid under it. I stumbled because the shift felt physical, a push against my chest. The person with me slapped a palm against a trunk to steady themselves and inhaled like they'd been underwater. Inside that flood of noise, there was a ghost of something else, a thread so fine I would have missed it if the earlier silence hadn't tuned me into every tiny anomaly. A shape of a word, too short to be clear, folded into the first rush of sound. It might have been run. It might have been go. It might have been nothing, but the way panic hears commands. But we both jerked our heads at the same time and started moving faster. The forest felt normal again, which almost made it worse. because normal suddenly meant untrustworthy. We hiked by road noise beacon, angling toward it, and the moment I recognized a stand of younger pines we'd passed on the way down, my knees felt weak with relief. The trail we'd meant to follow reappeared like a line saved on a hard drive. We climbed until the trees thinned, and the dirt road showed between trunks, a broad, welcome cut of human geometry. At the car, we didn't talk. Not right away. We drank water with shaking hands, and let the ordinary sounds of the world, our own doors closing, a distant engine, a crow's caw, reteach our bodies how to exist without bracing. Then, like people do when they feel foolish and lucky at the same time, we started minimizing it out loud. Temperature inversion, predator nearby, inner ear weirdness. Any explanation that let the forest be a forest, and not something with a finger on a mute button. That night, after the adrenaline washed out of my system, and the house felt safe and too silent in its own way, I pulled the audio from my camera. I hadn't planned to record anything beyond ambient notes, but I'd left the mic running for a few minutes near the seep. The waveform on the screen looked like it should soft noise, a subtle pattern of movement. I hit play. For the first minute, it was what you'd expect. And then there was a sudden flatline several minutes, where the microphone, which picks up every little thing in normal life, recorded almost nothing. Not room tone, not wind rumble, not insect song. Just a thin, almost hospital-clean hush. Near the end of that gap, a spike cut up through the silence. One sharp cracked the twig we'd heard. It sounded like it had happened an inch from the mic. Right after that, a smear of frequency I can't describe with a word you'd accept. Not a voice. Not a hiss. A texture that felt like breath might have a shape if you could see it. I closed the laptop and sat with the lights off a while, letting the refrigerator hum remind me which world I was in. Since then, I've thought about how much of our safety in the woods comes from listening. Hearing water before you see it. Hearing wind to guess weather. Hearing an animal so you don't surprise each other. We're built to trust the soundtrack. That day taught me something I didn't want. If the forest can turn that soundtrack off, even for a few minutes, the map in your head starts to blur. You forget which way feels right. You start rationing your breath like sound costs something. And when the noise returns, you can't unhear the space where it wasn't. Sometimes now, lying in bed with the window cracked, I'll wake to a strange quiet and hold myself very still, listening for what's missing. Most of the time it's nothing but normal night, the gap between cars, the house settling. But every once in a while, the silence feels heavy enough that I can taste it. And in those moments, I remember that snap the twig breaking in a room, with no walls, and the way a single, impossible hush in the middle of a living forest made me realize how thin the line is between orienting and being lost. I chose the canyon rim because I wanted to see stars without obstruction. The kind of darkness you can't find near town where light pollution turns the sky gray-orange at night. Prescott National Forest has a few established campsites, along exposed overlooks, places where the ground is flat enough for a tent, and the view drops away into emptiness on one side. This particular spot had a small fire ring of stacked stones, a few scuff marks from previous campers, and nothing else. No vault toilet, no picnic table, no trash can. Just you and the edge, and a lot of sky. I'd planned to spend 2 nights up there, solo, doing long exposure star photography, and catching sunrise from a ridge that looked out over layers of forested ridges, fading into distance. The weather looked stable, no storms forecast, and the wind that afternoon felt refreshing instead of threatening. I set up my tent carefully, staking it into thin soil over granite, because the rim didn't offer much depth. Each stake required a rock to hammer it in, and I tested the lines twice, because being a few steps from a sheer drop makes you thorough in ways you're not when camping in a meadow. By the time full dark came, the temperature had dropped sharply. Early spring in high country does that warm enough during the day to lull you, then cold enough at night to remind you that winter only recently let go. I layered up, made a small fire more for morale than warmth, and sat on a flat rock watching the Milky Way emerge in that stunning, humbling way it does when you're far from anything artificial. The silence was deep but comfortable. Wind gusted occasionally across the rim, making the tent fabric snap and settle, but it felt predictable. I was alone, yes, but not lonely. Not unsafe. just quietly present in a big, indifferent landscape. I went to bed around 11, satisfied with a few test shots and the prospect of waking early for the best light. My sleeping bag was warm, the pad underneath was decent, and I had that tired, clean exhaustion that comes from a day spent moving carefully in open air. I zipped the tent, turned off my headlamp, and let the darkness settle over me like a blanket. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was my imagination filling the silence, or the wind shifting gravel. But it came again, a distinct crunch, the sound of someone walking slowly on loose stone, circling the tent at a fixed distance, not close enough to touch the fabric, but close enough that I could track the movement by ear. The rhythm was steady, deliberate, the kind of pace someone takes when they're thinking, or waiting, or measuring something. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps continued, tracing a slow arc around my tent. I couldn't hear breathing. No cough. No shuffle of clothing. No snapped twig. Just that steady crunch, crunch, crunch on gravel, paced like a heartbeat. My first thought was another camper. Maybe someone who'd arrived late and was checking out the area. But I hadn't seen another car at the trailhead. And who walks circles around a stranger's tent in the middle of the night without announcing themselves? I called out, keeping my voice level. "Hello?" The footsteps stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like the air was holding still to listen. I waited, counting seconds in my head, trying to hear anything that would explain it. A deer would have bolted. A person would have answered, or at least made some other sound, a zipper, a stumble, something human. But there was nothing. I unzipped the tent part way, slow and quiet, and aimed my headlamp into the darkness. The beam cut a narrow tunnel of light across the campsite, catching the fire ring, a few scattered rocks, the flat ground, and beyond that, the black edge where the rim dropped away. No shape, no eyeshine, no movement. I kept the light on and scanned in a slow circle, painting the perimeter. The tent was surrounded by a ring of disturbed gravel, the kind of surface that shows every step. My own boot prints were there from when I'd set up, but beyond those, the gravel looked scuffed in a wide, smooth circle, as if someone had walked around the tent enough times to blur individual tracks into a continuous band. I clicked the light off, suddenly aware that being visible made me a target in ways I couldn't defend against. My pulse kicked up, and I could feel it in my throat. I sat inside the tent with the flap still open a few inches, ears straining, trying to separate the sound of wind from the sound of movement. The footsteps started again. Same pace, same distance. Like they'd waited politely for me to finish looking and were now resuming. This time, they came from my left, moving in a slow, clockwise arc. I could hear each step land and compress the gravel, a sound so clear and specific it felt invasive, like someone was deliberately making sure I knew they were there. I shouted this time, louder, with more edge. "Who's out there?" Again, immediate stop, immediate silence. And then, just as I started to second-guess myself, the footsteps resumed from the opposite direction, as if whatever was making them had switched positions without crossing the space in between. That's when my skin went cold. I zipped the tent fully, hands shaking enough that I fumbled the slider twice. I sat in the dark, bag pulled up to my chest, and tried to think through options. Leaving in the dark, on a rim with a sheer drop a few body lengths away, seemed more dangerous than staying put. But staying put, while something circled me, something that moved without sound between positions, something that stopped when I spoke and started when I didn't, felt like surrendering control. The footsteps continued, slow circles, patient, unrushed. I turned the headlamp back on inside the tent, just to have light. Even though it made the fabric glow and announced my shape to anything outside. I reached for my phone, thought about calling someone, and then realized how insane that would sound. I'm being circled by footsteps. What would they even do? Tell me to leave. Tell me it's wind. Tell me I'm imagining it. But I wasn't imagining it. The sound was too specific, too rhythmic, too tied to my reactions. At some point, I don't know when, because time became elastic in that tent, the footsteps approached closer, not dramatically, just a tightening of the circle, a step inward, then another pass, slightly closer still. It felt like a test, like something was measuring how much fear it could generate before I broke. I spoke again, not a shout this time, just a firm statement. I can hear you." The steps paused. Then, from what felt like only a few feet away, I heard two distinct taps, boot on stone, or knuckle on rock, something deliberately communicating. "I hear you too." My breath caught. That wasn't wind. That wasn't imagination. That was response. The footsteps resumed their circle, now close enough that I could feel a faint vibration through the ground with each step. Or maybe I was imagining the vibration. Maybe my body was so tense that every nerve was firing false alarms. But the sound was real. It kept going, around and around, like something was winding me up. Then it stopped at the tent door. I could hear breathing now, or something that sounded like breathing. Slow, controlled, just outside the fabric. The tent wall nearest my head bowed inward slightly, as if pressure had been applied without force, just presence. I stared at the place where the fabric curved and felt my throat close. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from that exact spot, came a single, soft exhale, dry, shallow. The kind of breath you make when you're very close to someone's ear and want them to know you're there. I jerked back, scrambling toward the far side of the tent, and in that motion, my elbow hit the side wall, making the whole structure shift. Outside, the footsteps moved 3 quick steps, fast and sharp, away from the door and back into the circle. I didn't sleep. I sat upright in my bag, with the headlamp on, knees pulled up, listening to those footsteps go around and around until the sky began to lighten and the stars faded and the wind picked up with the coming dawn. As the first gray light touched the tent walls, the footsteps slowed, then they stopped. I waited another 30 minutes before I unzipped the tent. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of light that makes everything look honest. I stepped out and walked the perimeter of where I'd heard the footsteps. The gravel was disturbed, yes, but in a way that could have been wind, or my own movement during setup, or the slow creep of erosion. There were no clear boot prints besides mine, no animal tracks, no signs of another person. But there was something else. The tent stakes on the side facing the canyon had been loosened, not pulled out, just worked halfway free, as if something had tested them gently during the night, nudging to see how much force it would take. I knelt and pressed one back into the ground, and my hands were steadier than they should have been, probably because daylight makes you feel like you can fix things. I packed up quickly, skipping breakfast, skipping the sunrise photos, just stuffing everything into my pack with the single-minded focus of someone who needs to not be there anymore. As I walked the trail back toward the trailhead, I looked over my shoulder more than I cared to admit, waiting for the sound of footsteps to start up again in the gravel behind me. They didn't. But a week later, I was hiking a completely different area, lower elevation, different forest, nowhere near that rim, and I stopped at a trailhead to tie my boot. In the quiet, I heard gravel crunch behind me, slow, even, deliberate. I turned fast, heart jumping, and saw a hiker 20 feet back, adjusting their pack, completely normal. They nodded and kept walking. But for a split second before I saw them, my body had already decided what that sound meant, and the fear was instant, automatic, like a switch I can't turn off. Because now, every time I hear footsteps on gravel at night, or in the early morning, or in a place where I thought I was alone, a part of me stops and counts the rhythm, waiting to see if it circles, waiting to see if it stops when I speak. And I think about those loosened tent stakes, and how close I was to the edge, and how easy it would have been for something patient enough to wait until I was asleep, until the wind covered the sound, until the fabric gave just a little more. I don't camp on rims anymore. The radio was supposed to be the most reassuring thing we carried. That's what they tell you in training. Out here, voices travel when bodies can't. If your ankle goes, if weather turns, if you take a wrong drainage and lose the road, a handheld can turn panic into procedure. I believed that. I trusted the little brick of plastic more than I trusted my own instincts. Because instincts get dramatic, and radios don't radios, either work or they don't. That evening in Prescott National Forest, I learned a third option. We were in a narrow ravine with steep sides. The kind of cut where the sun disappears early and the air turns damp, even when the day above feels dry. Late fall, near dusk. Fog wasn't supposed to be a factor, but it's funny how the low places make their own weather. It had started as a simple navigation drill. Follow a bearing down into the drainage, confirm location by terrain features, Practice check-ins with base. Nothing heroic. No urgency. Just repetition, the kind that builds muscle memory. I was with one other trainee, and our supervisor was remote monitoring from a vehicle closer to the main road, listening for our timed radio calls. We'd both done enough of these to know the routine. Call in, state location estimate, confirm heading, confirm conditions, move. The radio felt like a tether. Even when we couldn't see the world beyond the ravine walls, the radio made it feel like we weren't truly alone. We were about 20 minutes into the drainage when the first crackle came through. Not the normal carrier hiss, not the chirp of someone keying up. It was a short burst, like a mouth forming words through water half-syllables, clipped and indistinct. I stopped walking mid-step and looked at the radio clipped to my shoulder strap. Base, did you just transmit? I asked, pressing the push to talk. Only silence answered me, not even static. That was odd by itself. Radios always have some kind of background noise. This was like pressing your ear to a wall and hearing nothing on the other side. My partner's eyebrows lifted. I heard that too. The radio crackled again, and this time it was closer to speech, but still wrong. It sounded like more than one voice layered together, like a crowded room heard through a cheap speaker. Then it cut out with a sharp pop. I checked the channel. Correct. Volume normal. Battery showing strong. Everything looked ordinary, which made the sound feel more personal somehow, like the unit wasn't failing, it was choosing. We continued down, following the faint path the ravine offered. The ground was slick with damp leaves, the kind that hide rocks underneath. Each step required attention. The walls on either side were steep enough that getting out quickly wouldn't be easy, and the trees above formed a roof that blocked the last of the fading light. I could feel the temperature dropping against my cheeks. A third burst came through the radio, and this time there was a beep under it, thin and regular, like an emergency locator. Not loud, not constant, just a weak, persistent beeping that made my stomach tighten. We stopped again. My partner leaned closer to my shoulder, listening. The beeping continued for 3 seconds, then stopped abruptly, as if the signal had been cut. That's not our gear, my partner said. I keyed up. Base, we're getting interference and a beacon-like tone. Confirm no other teams in our sector. This time, Base answered immediately, calm and clear. Negative. No other teams in your area. Your audio is good. Continue drill. I stared at the radio like it had lied to me. If Base heard us clearly, and no one else was transmitting, then what were we hearing, and why only us? We moved again, but now I found myself listening more to the radio than the forest. That's a dangerous shift. The forest should be your main feed. Wind, water, animal movement, your own footsteps, telling you if the ground is stable. But the radio had become a second set of ears I couldn't stop checking. As we went deeper, fog started to appear in thin sheets. It slid along the ravine like it belonged there, softening edges, swallowing the distance between trees. My headlamp beam, turned on earlier than usual, lit up the fog in a pale cone, making it feel like we were walking inside our own little bubble of visibility. That's when the radio began to get busy. Short bursts at first, garbled syllables, static that surged and fell like breathing. Then overlapping snippets that sounded like conversation, a laugh, a word I couldn't catch, a sharp inhale. It was too human to be dismissed, but too broken to understand. I tried switching channels. The same noise followed, like a shadow moving with us. My partner's face tightened. This is messing with my head. I understood. There's something uniquely unsettling about voices you can't quite parse. Your brain keeps trying to complete them, to make meaning, and the effort burns energy you need for navigation and calm. We attempted a textbook response. We stopped. We took bearings. We confirmed our planned exit route up a side slope that should lead to a forest road. We made a decision together. Keep moving, but shorten the exercise and get out of the ravine before dark fully set in. The moment we agreed on turning back, the radio beep returned faster now, like a heart monitor speeding up. I felt my scalp prickle. That's reacting, my partner said, almost whispering. No, I said too quickly. It's just timing. But the beeping slowed as soon as we committed to climbing out. As if satisfied, the static softened. And for a few minutes, the radio was quiet enough that I could hear the forest again. The damp hush of leaves, the faint drip from moss, our breaths in the cold. Then a phrase cut through, clearer than anything before. Distorted, yes, but intelligible. 2 words. Spoken with the flatness of a cheap speaker. Behind you. My stomach dropped straight into my boots. I spun so hard, my headlamp beam whipped across fog and trees. Nothing. No shape in the light. No movement in the leaves. But the fog made everything feel closer than it was, and in that brief sweep, I caught the way shadows can look like bodies when you're already afraid. Base, I said, voice tight. Did you transmit behind you? Negative, Base responded, steady. No transmission from us. My partner's breathing picked up. We need to go. Now. We started moving faster, picking our way up the side slope. The climb was steeper than it looked from below, and damp leaves turned it into a slide. Halfway up, my partner slipped and banged a knee on a hidden rock. The sound, finally a normal, physical sound, made me flinch. Pain makes things real. Pain also makes you slow. I offered an arm, and we climbed, step by step, trying not to put too much weight on the injured knee. The radio crackled intermittently. Not with words now, but with a low warble, like a tone bending, searching. It reminded me of feedback when you bring a microphone too close to a speaker, except we weren't anywhere near an audio setup. We were in trees and fog and cold. As we got higher, the radio's signal meter, normally a decent indicator of strength, suddenly pegged full bars. That didn't make sense in that ravine. Coverage should be weaker, not stronger. It was as if something wanted us to believe we were connected. Then it happened. The radio screamed. A sudden shrill squeal of feedback, high and painful, like a needle dragged across glass. I jerked the unit away from my ear, heart pounding. The squeal lasted 3 seconds and then cut hard into absolute silence. Not the normal off-signal quiet, not the faint hiss of electronics. Pure, unnatural, nothing. As if the radio had stopped being a radio. My partner stared at it. Is it dead? I looked at the screen. Still on. Battery still full. But no hiss. No carrier. Just dead air. And in that dead air, right beside my ear, close enough that I felt the heat of it more than I heard it, I heard a voice that did not come from the speaker. You're going the wrong way. It was calm. Not shouted. Not distorted. It sounded like someone standing just behind my shoulder, speaking into the space between my ear and my neck. My entire body locked. For a second, I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe properly. I felt my heart slam in my chest. And a cold wash crawl down my spine. My partner's eyes were wide. You heard that? It wasn't a question. It was confirmation. Shared reality. I forced my legs to move. Keep climbing, I said, and my voice sounded far away, like I was speaking through cotton. We climbed harder, using roots as handholds, digging boots into dirt beneath the leaf layer. The fog thinned as we gained elevation, and with every step the world became more normal, more air, more wind, more distance. My partner's knee slowed us, but adrenaline kept us functional. Then we broke out onto a forest road. Packed dirt, open space, a strip of sky above. It was like stepping out of a tunnel. I turned back toward the ravine and waited to hear the radio squeal again, or the beeping, or that voice near my ear. Nothing. The radio hiss returned suddenly, as if it had been holding its breath too. Normal carrier noise. Normal, boring static. I keyed up and called Base, voice shaking despite my best effort. We're out, I said, exiting to the road now. Base answered, unbothered. Copy. Good work. Return to vehicle. We walked the road back in silence. My partner limped, and I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to hear my own words played back at me, or the beeping to start again. The radio stayed normal. It might as well have been a different unit. Later, back at the vehicle, Base checked logs. No unknown transmissions, no rogue IDs, no record of any beacon. The supervisors looked at us the way people look at someone describing a dream, polite, skeptical, trying to be kind without agreeing. I didn't argue, because arguing doesn't help when you can't prove sound. But I know what I heard, and I know where it was coming from. The behind you was from the radio. The wrong way wasn't. That voice was close enough to feel like a hand on the back of my neck, and it spoke at the exact moment our radio went unnaturally silent, as if the forest had temporarily muted the one thing we trusted, so something else could talk. A few days later, driving home with the car radio on a normal music station, the signal faded for a second. In the gap, a thin beeping pattern came through, weak, familiar. Like it had been waiting in the static all along. Then the song snapped back, clean and cheerful, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel, because part of me understood something I wish I didn't. Out there, even off, doesn't always mean quiet. The boulder field looked harmless in daylight, just a scatter of granite blocks tumbled down a slope long ago, sun-warmed and pale, with pockets of shadow in between. Late spring in Prescott National Forest can make you overconfident like that. The air is clear, the wind is mild, and everything feels navigable as long as you take your time. We weren't trying to summit anything or prove anything. We just wanted to scramble around, take photos of the weird shapes, and be back at the car before dark. That was the plan. The kind of plan you say out loud because it sounds responsible. It was the two of us, moving slowly across stone, calling out holds, and pointing out the best routes. Granite has its own smell when it's warm, dry, faintly metallic, like sun baked into rock. Every step had to be placed, and we kept our center of gravity low, careful with ankles. A twisted ankle in a boulder field isn't a walk-it-off problem, it's a now-you-live-here problem. We'd been out there maybe an hour when I heard the first whistle. 3 notes, simple, clean, not wind, not bird. A human whistle, the kind someone does absent-mindedly when they're trying to get someone's attention without shouting. It drifted over the rocks from ahead, faint but distinct, and it made me smile at first because it meant we weren't the only ones with the same idea. I whistled back. I matched the 3 notes as best I could, not even thinking. The response came immediately. Same 3 notes, same rhythm, same pitch. It was so accurate it almost sounded like my own whistle reflected back to me. Like a canyon echo, but there were no walls for an echo, just open slope and scattered stone. The sound came from ahead, somewhere beyond the next cluster of boulders. We exchanged a look, the kind that says, "Okay, someone's up there." We kept moving. The whistle repeated, steady as a metronome. 3 notes, pause, 3 notes. It didn't sound playful, it sounded patient, like a signal. "Maybe they're calling their dog," my partner said. "Maybe," I answered, though it didn't feel like that. When people call dogs, there's variation, tone changes, urgency, little improvisations. This was consistent, like someone hitting a button. We climbed over a waist-high slab, dropped into a shallow pocket of sand between rocks, and navigated around a split boulder that created a narrow passage. Each time we expected to crest a rock and see the person whistling, there was only more rock ahead, more sunlit granite and shadowed gaps. The whistle stayed ahead. Always ahead, not getting closer, not drifting farther, just keeping pace. That's when the unease crept in. Not a sudden fear, just a slow awareness that something wasn't aligning. In a boulder field, sightlines are short. You see movement easily because the landscape is simple rock, sky, sparse brush. If someone was whistling from ahead and we were closing distance, we should have seen them by now. A hat, a sleeve, a shifting silhouette, anything. But there was nothing. I decided to test it, the way your brain tries to restore order when order slips. I changed the tune. I whistled a different pattern, 4 notes, a little rise and fall, something unmistakably not the original 3. The response came back after a single beat. The same new pattern, perfect copy. I stopped walking. My partner stopped too. The sound did not come from the same exact point. It adjusted slightly, as if it had repositioned to remain ahead of us, tucked behind the next rocks. "Okay," my partner said, forcing a laugh that didn't land. "That's weird." I didn't laugh. My mouth had gone dry, and the dryness made me aware of my own breathing, loud in the still air. I looked around more carefully, scanning gaps between boulders, focusing on the dark spaces where someone could crouch. The shadows were thick, and some of the gaps were deep enough that you couldn't see the bottom. We didn't have headlamps. That was our first real mistake. We'd assumed late spring meant long light, and we'd assumed the boulder field would be quick, but the sun was already angling lower, and the rocks were starting to throw longer shadows. Blue hour comes early in places like that because stone steals sunlight and holds it, leaving the spaces between to cool and darken faster than the open slope. The whistle changed. Still 3 notes, but slower now, like it was searching. The 3rd note elongated slightly, almost sliding instead of stopping cleanly. It sounded curious. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a person signaling. It felt like something imitating the idea of a person signaling. My partner lowered their voice. "Let's just head back." I agreed immediately. No debate. No one needed convincing. We turned around, aiming for a route that would take us back toward the tree line, where the ground became more predictable. It's hard to move fast in a boulder field without risking injury, so we did what you do when you can't sprint. We moved efficiently, stepping with purpose, not stopping, keeping our balance. The whistle followed, not behind us, not echoing. It shifted again to stay in front now, in front of our retreat, which made no sense unless it was moving around us. But we never heard movement. No rock scuffs, no pebbles sliding, nothing that indicated footsteps above us. The whistle did something else then, something small that made my stomach clench. It matched our timing. Every time we paused to navigate a gap, the whistle paused. Every time we moved again, it resumed, as if it was watching and syncing itself to our decisions. I tried not to react. I tried not to feed it attention. But attention is hard to withhold when you can't locate a sound. Your mind keeps turning toward it, the way a compass needle keeps turning north. We crossed a cluster of rocks that formed a shallow hallway, two boulders leaning inward with a tight corridor between them. The air in there was cooler, and the sound of our breathing bounced off stone just enough to feel enclosed. Halfway through, the whistle erupted from above us, closer than before. Clear enough that it felt like it was whistled into the back of my neck. I ducked instinctively and smacked my shoulder on rock. My partner hissed a curse, not in anger but in raw nerves. We burst out into a wider patch of open stone, and the whistle came again, now from behind us. That was new. That was the first time it had broken its ahead pattern. I spun, scanning the boulders we'd just passed. Still nothing. The shadows were deeper now, and the gaps between rocks looked like mouths. My partner's voice trembled. "It's doing it on purpose." I didn't answer because any answer would have been a guess, and guessing felt like giving it a roll. Instead, I did the only practical thing I could think of. I took out my phone and opened the compass. The needle spun. Not just a little drift. It spun like it couldn't decide where north was. It stabilized for half a second, then spun again, jittering in small circles. I shook the phone, stepped away from the larger rocks, tried again. Same thing. Minerals in granite can mess with compasses. I knew that. I also knew how comforting it would have been to rely on that fact completely. But right then, with the whistle threading through the rocks and the light draining away, the spinning needle felt like the forest removing another tool from my hands. We moved toward what we thought was the tree line, guided by memory more than device. The rock underfoot cooled quickly as sunlight left it, and the temperature difference between sunlit surfaces and shadowed gaps made the air feel unstable, like cold pockets you could step into by accident. My partner's breath started coming faster. Mine did too. Then, a rock clattered above us. Not a little pebble, a fist-sized stone, bouncing and striking granite with sharp, clean impacts, clack, clack, clack before disappearing into a dark gap. We both froze, heads tilted up, trying to see where it came from. The whistle sounded at the exact moment the rock hit the second time, like punctuation. My partner whispered, "That could have hit someone." My mind flashed an image of us being herded into the gaps, coaxed and nudged by sound and falling stone until we made one wrong step. In a boulder field, one wrong step doesn't just hurt. It traps you between rocks where no one can see you. We pushed forward, quicker now, accepting scraped shins and bruised palms as the cost of speed. I kept my eyes on the outlines of trees ahead, dark against the sky, my only stable landmark. The whistle kept coming, and now it felt irritated. The notes slid slightly off pitch, descending at the end in a way that made my skin crawl, like a smile turning into a sneer. We reached a taller boulder, one of the last big ones, before the field thinned out, and I climbed it fast to get a better view. My hands found rough holds, my boots searched for purchase, and the stone was colder than I expected. I hauled myself up and looked out. The tree line was there, yes, closer than I feared. But between us and it were several clusters of rocks that formed deep creases, the kind that could swallow a person to the waist, to the chest, to the head, if they stepped wrong. I started to climb down, and the whistle erupted from below my feet. Not from ahead, not from behind, from inside the rock space beneath the boulder I stood on, so close and loud that my whole body jolted like I'd been touched. The sound was impossibly crisp, like someone had whistled through a narrow pipe directly into my ears. My boots slipped on the descent, just an inch, just enough to spike panic through my muscles. I caught myself, fingers scraping granite, and for a moment, I dangled with my weight half committed. The whistle held its last note too long, sliding downward, and the sensation I had purely instinctive was that it wanted me to fall into the gap. I landed hard, knees flexing, and grabbed my partner's sleeve without thinking. "We're going," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It sounded tight, clipped, survival-focused. We moved in a straight line toward the trees, choosing the safest steps we could, not the easiest. When we finally stepped off the last boulder and onto soil and needles, I felt a relief so intense it almost made me dizzy. The ground underfoot was quiet and forgiving again. The trees gave depth and direction back to the world. Behind us, from somewhere up among the rocks, the whistle sounded one last time. The original 3 notes: slow, clean, patient. Like a reset. Like a reminder that it could become simple again whenever it wanted. We didn't answer. We didn't look back more than once. We walked fast through the trees until we found a real trail, then faster still until the parking area came into view. Only when the car doors shut did my shoulders finally loosen. Later that night, I checked my phone out of stubbornness. I'd recorded a short clip earlier, not to capture the whistle, just to show a rock formation. The video was ordinary, but the audio held a single, crystal-clear bar of whistling under our quiet laughter. It wasn't faint, and it wasn't distant. It sounded as if it had been recorded right beside the microphone. What bothered me most wasn't that we heard something we couldn't explain. It was the way it listened back. The way it copied without effort. The way it stayed just out of sight, never letting us prove it was real with our eyes. Only letting us prove it with our fear. Because once you've been followed by a sound that learns you, every harmless whistle you hear later, every casual tune from a stranger on a sidewalk feels like it might be the start of a pattern you can't break. Monsoon season changes the forest in ways people don't respect until they're inside it. During the day, it's dramatic, towering clouds, distant thunder, rain that comes down in sheets so thick it looks solid. But at night, the storms turn the woods into a listening chamber. Water drips from every needle. The ground softens, your tent fabric stays damp. And when the rain pauses, even for a minute, the silence that follows doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like the world is waiting to hear what you do next. That was our second night out. And we'd picked a small clearing on a low valley floor because it was flat and sheltered. Not right next to a wash, not tucked under dead snags, not in a drainage that could turn into a river, just a reasonable spot between pines with enough open ground for our tent. We'd spent the afternoon dodging storms, moving when the sky allowed, stopping when thunder got too close. By evening we were tired in that heavy, damp way, where even your thoughts feel wet. We ate quickly, packed food away, did the routine you do when you want to sleep without worrying about animals, hung what we could, zipped what we couldn't, wiped hands, checked the area for scraps. Then we crawled into the tent while rain started up again, the kind of rain that makes you grateful for nylon. The sound on the rainfly was constant, loud enough that you don't hear much else, and that's what helped us fall asleep. Not comfort, just cover. Sometime after 2, I woke up needing to pee, the classic backpacking problem. I lay there debating whether it was worth leaving the warmth of my bag for the cold, wet outside. The rain was still going, but lighter now, more like a steady drip than a pounding sheet. My friend beside me was asleep, breathing slow. I was half awake, half in that strange state where your brain starts building stories out of noises. And then the rain stopped. Not gradually, it just quit, like someone had turned off a faucet. For a few seconds, the silence was so complete, I could hear individual drops falling from branches and hitting the ground one at a time. Plink, plink, plink. The forest's drip clock. I remember thinking, stupidly, finally. And then, I heard the breathing. Right next to the tent wall near my head. Slow inhale. Slow exhale. Not the soft breathing of someone asleep inside the tent. This was outside. I could tell, because the sound had that damp closeness, like it was pressing into the fabric. The exhale carried a faint whistle at the end, a tiny thread of air escaping through teeth or a narrow gap, controlled and steady. I didn't move at first. My body went rigid, like it had decided movement was dangerous. I stared into the dark, seeing nothing but the faint shape of the tent's ceiling. My mind tried to offer explanations in quick, panicked bursts. Deer sniffing, raccoon investigating, a javelina rooting around. But those animals don't breathe like that. They snuffle, they huff, they make little wet noises. This wasn't curiosity. This was calm. Another inhale. Another exhale. It was paced like a person trying to stay quiet on purpose. I held my breath to make sure it wasn't my imagination blending with my own breathing. The sound continued, unchanged. Outside. Close enough that I could imagine the heat of it against the fabric. My friend stirred slightly, sensing my tension the way people do even in sleep. I leaned toward them and whispered their name. The whisper felt obscene in the silence, like shouting in a library. The breathing stopped for 2 heartbeats. Then it resumed, slightly louder. Not louder in a random way. Louder like it wanted me to know it heard me. My friend's eyes opened. I could see the faint gleam of them in the dark. I mouthed, "Listen." We both lay still. The breathing continued. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. I watched my friend's face change confusion first, then that slow understanding that something is wrong when you can't explain it quickly. Their hand found my wrist in the dark, gripping too hard. I reached for my headlamp, which was tucked near my chest. My fingers felt clumsy, like they didn't belong to me. I didn't turn it on yet. I just held it, knowing that the moment light appeared, it would reveal our position perfectly from inside the tent. The breathing shifted. It didn't fade away with footsteps. It didn't crunch through needles. It didn't circle with sound. It was simply on the other side of the tent now, near my shoulder, like it had slid across the fabric without needing to cross the ground. My stomach tightened so hard it hurt. My friend whispered, "How?" I shook my head, though they couldn't see it. I didn't want to answer, because any answer would make it more real. We waited, frozen, listening. The rain began again, lightly at first, random drops, then a thin, steady patter. You'd think that would cover everything. But the breathing cut through it, like it was in the tent with us. It sounded dry, strangely unaffected by the wet world outside. The exhale still carried that slight whistle, that controlled leak of air. Then came the scrape. Not loud, not dramatic. A soft, careful drag along the tent stake line, like fingertips brushing the guy line, testing tension. The sound moved from one stake to the next, pausing briefly at each point, as if mapping the shape of the tent. I felt my throat go tight. In my mind I saw hands. I tried to force the image to be paws, claws, anything else. But the motion was too deliberate, too measured. Animals pull. They tug. They commit. This was a test. My friend's grip on my wrist tightened until it hurt. The breathing stopped again. In the pause, the forest sounded enormous. Rain on needles, water sliding off bark. Distant thunder that wasn't close enough to distract. The kind of normal that should have calmed me but didn't, because normal had already been broken. I clicked the headlamp on. The tent filled with harsh white light, turning the fabric walls into glowing panels. Our shadows jumped onto the nylon, large and distorted, making us look like strangers to ourselves. I aimed the light toward the side where the breathing had been, trying to catch a silhouette through the fabric. Nothing. No clear shadow. No outline of a head. No shape of a body. But the breathing had stopped mid-inhale, as if whoever was outside had frozen too. My friend whispered, "Do you see anything?" I shook my head again. No. We sat there in the bright tent, listening hard, waiting for the breathing to return. Minutes passed, in a way that felt both instant and endless. The rain steadied. The forest settled. Then, near our feet, the breathing started again. Right by the base of the tent, close enough that the fabric near the floor trembled slightly with each exhale. The sound was slower now, heavier, like whoever was doing it was savoring the fear it created. Inhale, exhale, and then something happened that made my blood run cold. The rainfly sagged for just a second, as if weight had leaned against it from outside. Not a full push, not enough to collapse anything. Just a subtle depression that made the fabric touch the inner wall for a moment, like a shoulder pressing in. My friend made a small involuntary sound, half gasp, half sob. I hated that sound because it felt like feeding it. I forced myself to speak loudly, the way you speak to a bear, even when you don't believe it's a bear. Go away. The words sounded ridiculous in the glowing tent. Outside? The breathing paused. Then came 3 quick inhales in a row, fast, excited, almost amused, right next to the fabric near our heads again, as if it had moved back instantly to hear my voice. I raised the headlamp and swept it around, as if light inside the tent could do anything. It couldn't. All it did was make our fear visible. Then lightning flashed. Not a distant flicker, a bright, immediate burst that turned the tent fabric into a camera flash. For a fraction of a second, the outside world printed itself onto the nylon in negative. The outline of nearby trees, the angle of the rain, the ground's texture. And on the tent wall, head level with us, there was a silhouette, not detailed, not enough to identify, but unmistakably taller than a deer, broader than a raccoon, shaped like a person close to the fabric. A head, a shoulder line, the suggestion of an upper body leaning in. The thunder hit right after, shaking the air so hard the tent vibrated. When the light outside faded back to night, the silhouette was gone. The breathing stopped. The rain continued like nothing had happened. We didn't move for a long time. We sat there in the headlamp glow, listening for the return of that slow inhale. It didn't come back. No footsteps retreated. No brush rustled. Nothing to indicate the thing outside had walked away. That was, in its own way, the most frightening part. Because it meant we couldn't track it like an animal. There was no sound trail, no exit cue. It was simply absent, the way a thought can be absent when you force it down. We stayed awake until dawn, not because we were brave, because sleep felt like an invitation. We took turns watching the tent walls as if we could will a shape to appear, as if observation could control reality. Every time the rain eased, our bodies stiffened, waiting for breathing to fill the gap again. When morning finally arrived, it didn't arrive gently. It arrived in a pale, washed-out light that made the clearing look ordinary and innocent. Birds began to call. Wind moved through pine needles. The world resumed its soundtrack, like a performance restarting. We unzipped the tent together, slowly, ready to see tracks, claw marks, anything. The ground around the tent was damp but not muddy enough for clean prints. We found our own boot marks from the night before, a few deer tracks farther out. And that was it. No obvious sign of a person, no torn fabric, no broken stakes. The guy lines were still taut. But the grass along one side of the tent was flattened in an oval patch, as if something had been lying there, close, resting, waiting, listening. And one stake, just one, was angled slightly differently than I remembered, turned a few degrees, like it had been nudged and then set back into place. We packed up without breakfast, hands moving fast, not speaking much. We didn't argue about whether it was an animal or a person or something else, because any debate would have been a way to stay mentally close to it. We just wanted distance. We just wanted trail and daylight and the safety of other sounds. That night, miles away from that clearing, we camped again because we had to. But we did it differently. We chose a spot where we could hear a creek constantly, where the sound never paused long enough for breathing to own the silence. We put earbuds in, not music, just low white noise, because it wasn't danger we were trying to block. It was the possibility of hearing that calm, controlled inhale right next to the tent wall again. And even now, when a storm passes and the rain stops abruptly, I catch myself holding still in that exact same way, listening for what fills the gap. Because once you've heard breathing that close in the dark, breathing that stops when you whisper and starts again like an answer, you don't ever trust a quiet night the same way again.